It's the third year running we've run Men's Health Connected. I'm glad to say that the need for these online events has reduced a little now as we start to return to the new normal. Myself, I've just come back from my my first real proper live event in Brisbane. I managed to get there and back without getting COVID or stopped at a border, and then spent 2 days stuck in Bundaberg because my town was flooded out. So I personally still love Zoom meetings because it means that I don't have to actually put on trousers or travel around the country. But I think most of us are starting to get a little bit tired of coming together online and looking forward to connecting more in person. But I think these online events still have a role, and it'll be a little while yet before we're certainly in a position to plan a big sort of face-to-face offline event. So it's great to have the opportunity to connect with you all so easily online again for the third year running. So I want to formally acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where we're meeting from all around of Australia, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I personally am joining you today from the lands of the Grengreng, the Grang, the Bunda and Balai people up on the central coast of Queensland. So this is Men's Health Connected. We have 5 days of online activities for you this year. If you haven't had a look already, make sure you do check the program for the other events. Hope you can make it to some other ones. We're covering the impact of exercise on men's health on Tuesday. We're looking at some tips and guidance on running men's health events from some great projects around the country on Wednesday. Thursday, we're putting a focus on hearing men's stories, making sure that lived experience is at the heart of all our work to improve men's health. And on Friday, we've got a couple of great workshops, one on suicide safety planning, run by the Marcus Mission, who work with young men in Queensland, and one on Know Your Man Facts, a heart health presentation for anyone who wants to get out there and do a talk, particularly during Men's Health Week. On men's heart health, we've got a session on how to use our toolkit to deliver that. And then today we're focused on the state of men's health. We've got 2 sessions coming up. Later on this morning, we've got an awesome panel of researchers sharing their detailed research with thousands of men across Australia on the impacts of COVID-19 on men's mental health. And to start the day and start the week, you've got me. And I'll let you know what I'm talking about when I get started in a few minutes. We've now got we've got 40 people in the room, and to start the week, I actually would like to give you the opportunity to just say hello to a few people. So I'm going to drop you into some breakout rooms for a couple of minutes. This is the equivalent of bumping into someone at the coffee cart or in the queue for the toilet at a real conference. I'll put you in rooms of about 6 people. Each take about a minute just to say hello, let people know where you're from, and importantly, let them know why you care about men's health. So we'll do that just now. Let's say, I'll go for 7 breakout rooms. And you just have to accept the invite, which is going to pop up in a minute. And you've got about 5 minutes, and you'll get about a minute, 30-second warning. So make sure, I know you've all got loads to say, but make sure everyone gets to go to say hello. All right, here we go. Opening the rooms now.
Well, I chose to.
9:35. and just check. Michael, are you wanting to join a breakout room? Michael McDowell. Hey, Michael, there should be just a little invite that pops up and invites you to join a room, Michael, if you want to go and join a room to say hello to some people. Thanks, Liam.
How it found me. This is walking along.
And they just attack you, isn't it? It's a bugger like that.
Might want to wrap up those breakout rooms shortly, Gun. I'm pretty sure they've been set up without a timer, so I just need to bring them in. Yeah.
I'm just about to broadcast closing in 10 seconds.
Cool, awesome.
All right. And closing all rooms.
Alrighty.
Thanks for adapting to that so quickly. No more surprises until the next one.
Hopefully. All right, cool. We got people coming back. Hello, everyone.
Great. Thanks. So, and I always find no matter how you time that, you'll always find that there'll be one person in the middle of saying something really interesting just as they yanked virtually back into the main room. So I apologize for anyone who was rudely interrupted in the flow of that. People are still arriving back, so I might repeat the next things I say a couple of times. Just remember that this is not like TV. It's not just you watching the presenter. We really encourage you to connect and network with each other. The breakout rooms are just a quick opportunity to show you that it's not just presenters and speakers, but also you've got right throughout the day, you've got the chat feature. You can direct message anyone that you want to, as long as they're happy to be messaged by you. And you can also send messages to the entire group. So please do use the chat box. It's there to help you to connect and contribute. Welcome back. I think we're all back in the room now. So yeah, as I said, please do use the chat box to ask questions, to post links, to say hello, or use the direct message feature to connect with to people. So let's crack on. Hopefully you've got a sense of met some new people, maybe reacquainted yourself with some old friends. So this first session really is an opportunity to reflect on what the state of men's health is in Australia in 2022. And initially, when I was looking at this, I thought it'd be a really great idea to look back over, say, for example, the last 5 years, because we're just approaching 5 years since the federal government made a financial commitment to men's health, launched a program called the Male Health Initiative, which included funding for the Australian Men's Health Forum, and started work on renewing the National Men's Health Strategy. There's a real delay, though, in getting statistics. So the current most of the statistics we have on men's health at the moment date back to 2020. So if you try and look back to 2017, you've only really got 3 years of data to look at. So mostly what I've done is had a look at 10 years. So I've kind of had a look through data from 2010, when actually the first national male health policy was launched, through to 2020. It gives us a sort of big enough period of time to get a sense of what the general direction is in men's health. And that does show movement, in both positive movement and negative movement. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. But I'm really interested in hearing, your thoughts and experiences and contributions throughout. I've given a good chunk of time to this. So if you don't get a chance to sort of pick up stuff as we go along, we'll certainly have plenty of time for a good, rigorous conversation in the second part of this session. So I might not be as receptive to responding to sort of questions and observations early on in this session as I'm working through the presentation, but there'll be, rest assured, there's plenty of time at the end to continue the conversation. So with that in mind, let's crack on. So if you do have any thoughts or questions, I mean, you can use the raise hand feature. I may stop and sort of take sort of interruptions as we go along, but certainly pop questions in the chat box and thoughts as the session unfolds. Right. So without no further ado, let me share my screen. And are we all seeing that?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So the state of men's health in 2022. I mean, I think the first thing to just reflect on is, what do we actually mean when we talk about men's health? I mean, what's the average person in the street think when you sort of talk about men's health? Well, for a lot of people and for a lot of time in the history of men's health is very much focused on the parts of the male body which are different to the female body. It was all prostates and penises and testicular cancer, all important issues still today, but I'm pretty certain that everyone in this conversation will agree that men's health is more than just what's below the waistline. So, but there are differing views on how we define men's health. Here are just 5 of them. So the first concept of men's health is biological. It's the parts of the male anatomy which differ from the female anatomy. And then there's a big focus beyond that on kind of on men's health behavior. So it's the stuff that sort of like makes us ill, like smoking and drinking and seeking help or not seeking help. And when you have that view, then the sort of the approach you would take to addressing men's health issues is really just to try and get men to stop doing those things. And as again, that's a sort of very preventative approach to health, and it does have value. Men's health improves if they stop smoking or stop drinking or lose weight or all the rest of it. Those things are important. None of these perspectives are sort of mutually exclusive. The other one that starts to put men's health on the radar in a more sort of significant way is the epidemiological focus. So when we start to actually look at all the things that kill us, and you start to see these different patterns. So it's not just prostate cancer, which kills more men than women because only men have prostate. It's there are patterns like suicide and heart disease and accidents that actually have a sort of gendered kind of split often, and so that sort of gives us the indication that to improve men's health and women's health, we often need to focus on different diseases. But then why is that? Why is that? So there's a couple of perspectives on why that is. Getting some background noise. So just a reminder, you could actually mute yourself when you're not talking. Otherwise, I get heckled. Thank you. So one that's been a sort of a big focus of certainly a big segment of the men's health sector is the social determinants of just one second, just realizing I'm not full screen on my PowerPoint now. That's better. Is the social determinant perspective. So if we think of smoking, drinking, weight as the causes of poor health, then those things like our financial well-being or our housing situation or our level of education, which actually is considered to be the causes of the causes. And so if you just focus on trying to get people to stop smoking or lose weight or get screened for health issues, you're just scratching the surface. You're not actually dealing with the underlying causes. And certainly in 2010, there was a big focus on at a policy level on the idea that men's health should address the social determinants. And there's also additionally a big wave of focus in the men's health field, which looks at masculinities and sort of equates men's poor health with unhealthy masculinities. Now, I think all of these approaches, and there's more besides, are valuable from my perspective, but none alone will ever actually resolve the challenges that we face in the men's health world. Now, is anything actually getting better? Because we often talk about the crisis in men's health, but actually is men's health improving in any way? We became one of the first countries in the world in 2010 to have a male health policy. So since 2010 to 2020, has anything changed and improved? Well, there's certainly some areas where, on average, men's health has got better. So the average age of death is sort of creeping upwards. We live about 1 year longer on average, or 0.9 of a year to be precise. There's certainly been a noticeable fall in what are referred to as potentially avoidable deaths. So potentially avoidable deaths are deaths under 75, which could have been avoided through different lifestyle or screening or intervention. And within that, you've seen significant falls in over a 10-year period in diseases like heart disease, rates down 30%. And I'm talking about rates here. So that's the number per 100,000 population. I'm not talking about the numbers, because the numbers can go up because the population is bigger. If you want to compare apples with apples and get a clear sense of whether what change is happening, you have to look at the actual rates rather than the numbers. So yeah, rates of heart disease most significantly have fallen in them 30%. These are deaths, by the way. The rates of cerebrovascular disease like stroke down 25%, road traffic accidents down 25%, and rates of cancer death down 20%. So those are significant changes in a fairly short period of time, you know, and if over the next 10 years we saw that to continue, that would be a very positive thing. But it's not all good news, as the doctor would say to you, first the good news, then the bad news. If you look through this list, these are some of the diseases where death rates are increasing. We've all got to die of something, right? And you'll notice within that, one of the big changes over the last 10 years has been diseases of aging. The number of men now living longer, but therefore suffering with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia. All of those have gone up significantly, many more men experiencing that. But also there's some sort of counterintuitive stuff. Well, you know, heart disease and stroke is going down, diabetes is going up, something which is largely driven by weight and diet. And also rates of suicide in the last 10 years, whilst they've stabilized in the last couple of years, they've certainly to continue to rise. And death by external causes, that's a category which includes suicide, it includes violent assault, it includes road traffic accidents and any other form of kind of like accident, like a drowning or accidental poisoning. That's an area that's gone up almost entirely due to accidental poisoning, which is like overdosing, you know, poisoning yourself with too much alcohol, that type of stuff. So deaths that some people would even consider might be considered to be suicides that weren't sort of classified as suicides in some cases. So there's those areas which are, so the shifts we're seeing are that there's greater need for healthcare and support for older men, because many more men are living to an older age. That's one of the challenges of becoming a healthier society where people live longer. But also some you know, the disease of affluence. Diabetes is something which only tends to arise at such volume in the West, and also this stubborn issue of suicide and related issues like accidental poisoning, deaths of despair, which are even not reducing, depending on which year you measure. They're even not reducing, or indeed at times they're going up. In contrast to other stuff going down. So, you know, heart disease going down, strokes going down, road traffic accidents going down, but at the same time, suicide and death by poisoning staying the same or going up, which is you know, something I think we clearly need to talk more about. And so, although men's health is improving, it's still a big issue, just in its own right. Not comparing it to women's health, just looking at men's health across the board. You've got heart disease killing 10,000 men a year. You've got cancer killing 1 in 3 men. That's 500 men a week. You've got diabetes now killing more than 50 men a week. Suicide still killing nearly 7 men a day, 45 men a week. And death by external causes killing 20 men a day. And then if we look at the comparison between men's health and women's health, there are still some really significant gaps, and these are the ones that I've picked out. So of those potentially avoidable deaths, which are deaths under 75, which could have been avoided, 2 in 3 Aussies who died from a potentially avoidable death before the age of 75 are men. A big part of that is heart disease. 4 in 5 heart disease deaths under 75 are men. 3 in 4 suicides, still men. 3 in 4 road deaths, still men. Not surprisingly, 96% of workplace deaths, still men. 73% of alcohol-induced deaths are men, and 7 in 10 homicides are men. And I think if you look at one figure that wraps all of that up, if you want to sort of like make the case that, you know, men's health in the round is a significant issue which needs to be addressed, then look at the figures for potentially avoidable deaths, because 50 men a day in Australia are dying of potentially avoidable deaths. And if we could close that gap in such a way that the rate of potentially avoidable death was the same in men and women, then we would save the lives of 7,500 men a year. I think that is a really sort of stark and significant figure. You know, we talk a lot about suicide for obvious reasons, and the 7 men a day we're losing, and include that those men are part of a bigger picture, which is 50 men a day who are dying of deaths that could be avoided with the right intervention, the right care, the right type of support. And I'm just going to pause there. I'm just going to have a quick look at the chat if I can work out how to do that. See what kind of things people are chipping in. Some people saying hello. Yeah. Okay. Remember, if you've got any questions or comments you want to pop in, just drop those in the chat box, and we'll try and pick them up as we go along. So, moving on from that sort of, you know, that's acknowledgement of improvement, but that's affirmation that there are still some major issues we need to address. Let's remind ourselves about the social determinants. So this is a bit of mapping that we did when we first sort of started our work with the Department of Health back in 2017, because the social determinants of health have been spoken about a lot, but if you look in the literature, you can't really find a great deal of focus on the social determinants of health and gender. And when you do, it tends to actually focus on how gender inequalities impact women. It doesn't talk about, doesn't sort of explain why men's poorer health is socially determined. And of all those sort of, so if you look over on the right, there's those things like those individual factors that we all know about. Yeah, sure, you know, smoking, drinking, diet, exercise, your weight, your self-care, they will all impact your health. And if we can make a difference at an individual level to men, you know, not smoking, drinking less, having a better diet, being more physically active, taking care of their weight, having good social connection, having good relationships, having good access to support services, that will have, in course, improved their health. But that's, in some ways, that's the end of a long process, which leads to poor health outcomes. So if you look at what kind of life experiences impact men's health and well-being, well, it's things like the education we give to boys. It's our experiences of fatherhood, both as sons and of fathers. It's our working lives, which play such a major part in the lives of men of working age. It's the social connections and relationships we have. It's the conditions we live in, and it's whether we got access to good support that understands how to work with men as and when we need it. Those things are still important. And if you doubt that those things make a difference, then you can start to map on, you know, some of the health outcomes for different groups of men. So if you just compare the health outcomes from men from the poorer background to men who are wealthier, basically with doesn't matter how you measure it. You measure it in terms of people's educational outcome, their income, their housing status. There's different ways of measuring socioeconomic status. But it just follows a trajectory on any kind of health indicator. The lower your socioeconomic status, the worse your health, and the better your economic status, the better your health. And this is something which happens with both men and women, but the gradient is much starker with men. So the lower men's status in society, however that's measured, then the worse their health by far, and more so than with women. And you know, the ones that really show up, socioeconomic status, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander males still on average way behind non-Indigenous men in terms of a wide variety of health outcomes, and it often shows up quite starkly in the difference between the health of rural and remote men and metropolitan men. There are other groups that we could refer to: LGBTI+, men with disabilities, veterans, men who've been in prison, men who are homeless, men who are socially isolated. But I think these three are the ones that show up most starkly across a whole range of measures.
Hey man, we're just doing a lot of talk.
Sorry, is someone's chipping in?
Just had a little bit of background noise, Glenn, which
Yeah,
okay. Played up now.
Great, thank you. So I've lost my, there we go. I am having a bit of trouble with this. There it is. There it is. Okay. So the question for us was what are the things that that happen to those men and boys from those backgrounds that will lead later in life to poorer health, before we actually start that process of just trying to get people to stop smoking or trying to get people to go to the doctor? What are the things earlier in life which actually lead to those disparities? And one of the obvious ones for me is education, and it's absolute crying shame still that we do not have boys' education on the agenda as a policy issue, because at every stage of education, schools are doing a better job at educating girls than they are educating boys. And the data is really clear. For every additional year of education you have, you tend to get, broadly speaking, an additional year of life expectancy. And if you want to improve men's health tomorrow, doing a better job of educating boys today is something which will generate results. So the fact that we don't actually have any national focus on improving boys' educational outcomes, to me, is a real missing. Our challenge is it's not something which the health system has the power to do. So the health department does not have the authority to improve boys' education. But if it could do one thing to improve men's health in 20 years' time, it would be to actually improve the education that boys get today in 2022. And there are many others. I mean, the role of fathers. You'll find a really stark difference between children, broadly speaking, children who grow up with a father around and don't have a father around. We know that actually, as fathers ourselves, relationship breakdown is one of the things that can have the biggest impact in terms of mental health and a whole range of different other health outcomes. And you'll see massive difference in terms of work. Unemployment is a major risk factor for men's health. And if you look at, so we'll be talking about COVID later on today, and there's something around work and providing, and the inability to work and provide, which impacts men. It obviously impacts men and women, right? You get a change in economic circumstances. People can't work. If there's less money coming into the family, it impacts men, it impacts women, it impacts the children. But there is something about economic difficulty, which is probably just very strongly linked to men's role as providers, which is still the case in most families with children, that it impacts men's health far more profoundly than it impacts women's health. And for all the moves forward we've made in equality and the involvement of fathers and and women in the workplace, that difference is still stark, something which certainly showed up in our research on COVID-19 and men's mental health, where so many people were impacted by the inability to work because of the lockdown. And you see it really profoundly in things like suicide figures, when you have something like the global financial crash. It's a massive increase in suicides following the global financial crash. Most of those suicides were men. I've put discrimination in there. I mean, more broadly there, I'm thinking about the impacts of discrimination on Indigenous men, on gay men. But there's a case to be made as well that men in general may be discriminated against in some ways, and if they are, that will be, for example, the prime example you'll get from our sector is the way that men are treated by the family courts. And then just more broadly, when we talk about social determinants of health, one of the key social determinants is the access to appropriate health services. If you're rural, that's being able to get to services. If you come from a culturally linguistically diverse background, that's getting access to services which are culturally appropriate. And I assert that if you're a man, that's actually being able to get access to services that actually respond to your needs as a man. They're culturally appropriate for men. They are male-friendly services. So it's really hard to actually measure how well we've done quantitatively in those areas in the past in the past 10 years. But I think there's perhaps another reason why those areas don't get addressed. They have a much more qualitative dimension to them. But they're all issues that we need to address if we want to improve men's health. And there are areas where I don't think we're doing as much as we could. So something else from the last 10 years, well, certainly even the last 5 years that I've really noticed is actually the men's health sector is definitely growing. I can't give you a figure for it. I can't tell you how many men's health projects there are, or how many dollars there are in men's health projects, or how many people there are working in the sector. But anyone who's been around the sector in the last 5 years will have noticed this upswell, particularly of grassroots men's mental health projects. It's not the only area of growth, but it's so profound in that area that you can't deny it. You cannot deny it. In the way that 30 years ago, there were no men's sheds. Well, now there's more men's sheds in Australia than there are McDonald's. And we just take that for granted as part of Australian life. Well, in the past 5 years, there weren't really many sort of grassroots men's mental health projects. Now there are hundreds. Initiatives like Mr. Perfect, the Man Walk, Men's Table, which have between them a couple of hundred different sort of projects running around the country. And then many more initiatives that just operate in one area. And many of them becoming new members of the Australian Men's Health Forum in the last few years. Grab Life by the Balls, Mentoring Men, and then also a real expansion of programs around fathers. There's the Dads Group and also the Fathering Project, which have grown massively. Dads Group working with connecting dads who are sort of got babies, newborns, and the Fathering Project going into primary schools all over the country and supporting dads with kids of primary age. So that's really exciting. There is this sort of grassroots driven response to men's lack of social connection, men's desire to connect with other men and access support, which is something to really celebrate. And men have got up and done it themselves. And that is really, really exciting. So that's to be praised. More men's health projects. A lot of them are self-funded, but we're also seeing more funding, particularly at a local level, through things like primary health networks going to men's health projects. And there's no doubt there's a much bigger public conversation now about men's mental health than there was 10 years ago, for example. But another thing we've observed over the last 5 or 6 years is a kind of falling away of any kind of administrative structures at state and territory level in particular. So 5 or 6 years ago, there were a couple of peak bodies for men's health operating at state level. Now we have one, you could argue two. There's the Tasmania and WA. And also, since 2010, a number of states introduced their own state men's health policies. Places like Victoria and South Australia would have men's health policies, and those have disappeared. Now we only have one really significant state-based men's health policy, which is WA, and there's also a less significant men's health framework published by the New South Wales government. So there's been this upward growth from the grassroots. There's been a bit more funding at a sort of federal level through the Male Health Initiative, but then there's this breakdown at a state and territory level. And that's really important because a lot of the work that gets done gets filtered from federal to state and territory. And if those structures aren't in place, we're missing out on a lot of opportunities to make sure that men's health is taken care of. There's certainly been progress at a policy level in the last few years. This was the launch of the new National Men's Health Strategy. So we had as you know, a men's health policy in 2010. There was a bit of funding behind that for 2 or 3 years. And then it really kind of fell off the radar, and organizations like the Australian Men's Health Forum advocated for it to be renewed. We were successful in making that case. And so we saw this revival through the development of the National Men's Health Strategy. And that's a really positive thing. There are very few countries in the world that actually have a National Men's Health Strategy. You can certainly tear it apart and critique it and say it could be a lot better, which it could, but we are one of the few countries in the world to have one, and that is a very positive thing. And we've now had a Labour government and a Liberal government that have developed policies, so it's something which has been embraced across the political spectrum. And hopefully, whoever comes in next, whoever's in power in a couple of weeks' time, that government will continue to support that strategy, we hope. So as I've said already, in terms of progress, yes, we've had the new National Men's Health Strategy. We've seen a bit of funding for organisations like ourselves and Healthy Male and the Centre for Male Health at the University of Western Sydney, ongoing funding of the 10 to Men longitudinal study on men's health, and continued funding elsewhere of men's sheds in Australia, which is something that wasn't happening 10 years ago. Now we're getting annual sort of national funding for men's sheds. And we've also seen a men's health organisation funded as a peak advisory body for the first time. So there's this pot of funding called the Health Peak and Advisory Body Fund. It recognises that certain groups, whether they're professional groups or groups representing different populations, need to be supported to advocate on behalf of the population or the profession that they represent. Men's health has traditionally not been funded through that programme, but starting from the 1st of July for 3 years, the Australian Men's Health Forum will be recognised and funded as the national peak body for men's health, which hopefully gets us in a lot more rooms and gets our voice heard and the voice of men's health heard in a lot more places in the Department of Health. And I wanted to sort of highlight the progress we've seen in terms of male suicide. Whilst it's an issue that's not improving in terms of the numbers, there's certainly been a lot of action at government level. The Prime Minister appointed a national advisor. The national advisor's recommendations include a strong focus on men as a priority population, and we certainly played a big role in making sure that happened. We've seen a lot of funding targeted at suicide prevention at the kind of like regional level of primary health networks. For those who don't know, there are about 31 primary health networks across the country who receive funding direct from government. That sort of bypasses the states and the territories. And maybe up to about 10 of those 30 PHNs have specifically funded projects in their local communities that are directed at men, so that's enabled a lot more sort of community-based projects targeting men to be funded through that system. And also our sort of sister brother organisation, Suicide Prevention Australia, which is the peak body for suicide prevention organisations, has really upped its game under its new leadership in terms of male suicide. And is now a key voice advocating for a national male suicide prevention strategy. We've been working closely with them, and that brings an additional voice, and in many ways a stronger voice than ours. It's a bigger organisation. It's more recognised in government in terms of the suicide prevention space, and very on board with advocating for a greater focus on male suicide. So that's all progress we've seen in the last 3 or 5 years, which it may take a few years to see the positive knock-on of that. But I think that those are very positive developments and show what can happen when you've got organisations advocating for men's concerns on an ongoing basis. But the reality is, at a political level, men's health is still really not a priority. we're in the mix, but really low down in terms of the agenda. Back in 2016, before we'd convinced the government to renew the men's health strategy, we had a position paper which made the point that it's not the sexiest statement, but it's very pertinent. The men's health is bereft of administrative structures. And what we mean by that is that if you look right across the different levels of government, you'll find there are departments for women, there are women's health strategies, not just at a national level, but every state and territory level. So work that gets done to improve the lives and health of women not only gets funded and driven from the federal government, it filters down to state and territory level, because every government in the land that has any significance has a focus on it, has funding attached to that work, has people in office who are doing that work, commissions services that respond to the needs of women and girls. And there just is not a comparable network of structures for men. As I said, only WA and New South Wales have anything remotely touching a men's health policy. And the actual national men's health strategy, now to be critical, is very much stuck in a silo. It exists in isolation from other strategies. So great, we've got this national men's health strategy that says all these things are important: suicide, heart disease, and tackling mental health, and helping men age in a healthy way into later life. It's got all the things that you would want in there, mostly from a health perspective. But the moment, that's not where the action is. In terms of health funding and health focus, there are other strategies and policies. A key example being the National Suicide Prevention Strategy fails to mention any of the stuff from the men's health strategy. So great, you've got this men's health strategy, says you need to target these issues, you need to make sure services are male friendly, you need to take into account the needs and preferences of men and boys in designing and commissioning and funding and delivering services. So there's all the right things in that regard. But then when you get over to the suicide prevention strategy, where the action is, none of that filters through. So we have a really beautiful piece of paper, which often the principles within it do not get enacted across the rest of they don't get enacted across the rest of the health department, never mind the rest of the government. And so most of the other health strategies that have come out in the last couple of years after the men's health strategy, obesity strategy, alcohol strategies, accident and injury strategy, preventative health strategy, they ignore or exclude men. And I saw this most starkly just in the past couple of weeks, where we saw that the government had acted on one of its commitments that came out of its work with the National Suicide Prevention Advisor, who, remember, I said, put a very clear focus on saying that men were a priority population. And then one of the actions was for there to be a national agreement between the different governments and territories, because they weren't operating in a coordinated way. And so back in March, the government completed this. And so every government, state and territory in the country, they're all signed up to the shared national agreement, which outlines the actions they will take to prevent suicide and where the funding will be directed. There are 15 priority populations named in that strategy. And believe it or not, men, who account for 3 in 4 suicides, are not included. So that was deeply disappointing to see that after all the progress we've made, and something that we'll be picking up and working through after the election. It's not all about the money, and I'm really very reluctant to make the story about men's health to be a competition for money between men and women. Many colleagues in the men's health space take the view that we shouldn't even focus on that at all, because it just creates sort of this oppositional view. But the fact is, the difference in funding that gets specifically targeted at men and specifically targeted at women is so stark that I really do feel it needs to be part of the national conversation about men's health. We're very quick to say men need to do better in terms of looking after their health, and yet at a national level, where we direct our taxes, we put far less money towards men's health than women's health, and then we're surprised that men's health is worse than women's. So here are some of the examples we picked up over the last couple of years. Most recently, the last couple of budgets, there's been a specific women's budget. There is the idea of a women's budget has been around in Australia for 40 years. There's a really big sort of focus on presenting and highlighting the women's budget in the last couple of budgets. You could be cynical and say that was because the government wasn't polling well amongst female voters. It's not to say that they necessarily put extra money towards women's health issues, more that they actually made a bigger fanfare about presenting that and making sure there was press releases about it. So last year's budget, we saw 3.4 billion allocated to a women's budget, of which over 500 million was for health. No parallel men's budget, no parallel commitment to fund men's health. Again, this year, just before the election, another 2.1 billion promised to a women's budget, another 300+ million specifically allocated to the National Women's Health Strategy. Nothing in the budget about channeling funds towards the men's health strategy. It was similar when they launched the women's health and men's health strategies just before the previous election in 2019. It wasn't a big amounts, but I think about 17 million got announced for men and 51 million for women. So the difference was ×3. If you track each year where funding from the National Health Medical Research Council goes, which is up over the last sort of 7 or 8 years, I've tracked, and it's over $1 billion now gone towards health in women's health research. Well, depending on how you measure it, if you just look at men's health and women's health, it's 5 times more funding we put towards researching women's health than men's health. If you include maternal health, so women and maternal health, it's 7.5 times more funding that we keep channeling on an annual basis towards women's health research versus men's health research. And an analysis that we did ourselves on where suicide prevention funding goes. It's hard to map all of the funding because you don't always get a breakdown of gender. But when we looked at some of the key projects that are being funded at a national level in terms of suicide prevention, and then mapped who those projects were reaching men or were they reaching women, we found that up to 4 in 5 beneficiaries of suicide prevention funding end up being women at risk of suicide, which in a world where 3 in 4 people who suicide are men, there's clearly an imbalance there. We are not advocating for taking money away from women's health at all, but I think we would see a much greater improvement in men's health if we were investing the same amount in men's health as that we were investing in women's health. So how do politicians of all colours get away with that? Well, it's because it's not a vote winner. It's not, men's health isn't a social issue. They can get away with not talking about it. They can get away with not sort of committing money to it. So looking to the future, how do we make men's health a social issue? And I've got these 3 questions from a political mover and shaker who we did some work with, who gave us some guidance on, what are the key factors that you need in place to actually make something an issue of concern to the public, and therefore an issue of concern to politicians. And the 3 questions to consider are, well, is it a serious issue? Well, we could save the lives of 7,500 men a year if we close the gap in terms of potential avoidable deaths. So I'd say, yes, it is a serious issue. Is it unfair or unjust? That's probably the hardest one to pull off, because people are very quick to say, well, at the end of the day, it's men's responsibility. And of course, part of health is actually men being responsible for their own health. But is it unfair and unjust that we've created a system where we produce better health outcomes for women and for men? It's a hard argument to make, but people are starting to respond to the unfairness and the unjustness, certainly around things like the high rates of suicide and mental health. The feedback we're starting to get from sort of public research is that people do think that more needs to be done and more funding needs to be directly targeted at men's projects. And the final piece is, well, is it a collective responsibility? Because if we only view health as being an individual responsibility, then why would we want or expect the government to take action? And so there's always that tension between recognizing that on an individual level, it is the individual level who has to take the action to improve their health, but collectively, we need to create environments and contexts where it's easier for them to take to live healthier lives. And that's a harder argument to make for men than it is for women. There's some good research out there that tends to show that the public is more supportive of policy interventions and charity interventions for women than men, even if it's the same issue. So there's a way to go in actually creating a world where collectively we're saying to ourselves, rather than why don't men get help or why don't men have better health, is that how can we get better at helping men, and how can we get better at producing a world that produces healthier men and healthier boys. So the final thought is, where now for men's health? That's in many ways, it's a big question, and I'm sure every single one of you would have a different answer, which is fine. And so you should, and that's what we need. We need a big dynamic community of people with lots of solutions and answers that they're going to put into action in terms of improving men's health into the future. But for an organisation like the Australian Men's Health Forum, which is operating at a contextual level, we're trying to shift the context slowly over time. What are the key things we need to focus on? Well, these aren't very sexy, but I think they're really important. That crumbling of the quite flimsy structures we already had 5 or 6 years ago, I think that's a concern to me. Is if we don't actually, how can all the governments, all the states, territory and federal government get together, sign a massive agreement about suicide prevention and exclude men from it? How can that happen? It happens because we don't have the networks and structures in place to hold all of those governments to account. So long term for me, we just need to get better at building those kind of strategic networks at a state and territory level, which is really tough because the people who are most passionate about men's health are often at grassroots doing the work, and you just don't have the time, space, capacity, resources, or even desire to do that kind of strategic networking and work. But it's just because it's a difficult challenge doesn't mean to say we shouldn't take it on. We shouldn't expect those people whose primary focus is to deliver grassroots support to be doing strategic work. We need different people doing different jobs, but we certainly should be doing all we can to champion and support and help that grassroots movement grow, because that is the most dynamic and exciting thing that's happening in men's health. And anything we can do to help that grow faster, be bigger, better, stronger, however we do that, is something that we need to do as a national body. And then finally, I think we really need to amplify men's voices in both the public and the political discourse. There's this weird tension in the culture at the moment where, on one hand, men are told they speak too much, they mansplain, they're taking up too much space, they need to make space for others, and they're also being chastised for not talking and not sharing what's going on for them. And I think when you look at stuff like the way that the voice of lived experience has been embraced increasingly in the mental health world, then we need to follow that model and actually get men's stories out there. It's not so much, men's sort of like opinions of what should change, so that's part of the mix. It's actually men bringing their stories and their experiences and being able to articulate what they've been through and what their needs are in mental health and suicide prevention, in physical health and social well-being, in relationship breakdown, in all those different areas. Those stories, I believe, we need to bring to the table, because the facts and figures are stark. No one can argue with the facts and figures about men's health, but they're very impersonal. And what's needed in the mix is the personal stories, the advocates who can actually share what's going on for them, what they've been through, and actually persuade people that we do need to take more action to improve the lives and health of men and boys in Australia. That's the state of men's health in 2022. I'm aware that I've done a lot of talking, so I will happily open up to some questions, some observations, and if you could do that with If you could use the icons to show your hands, then it'll make it easy for me to pick people out. I know we covered a lot of area there, so hoping someone's got something to add. No? Oh, great. I can go home then.
Sorry, Ken, I don't know how to put my hand up, but I'll
okay,
say,
John, you're on.
Just
John
to get
Harper.
it going.
Yeah.
I think that it comes down basically to education. I personally don't agree that it's necessarily a government decree or funding issue. I think it's everybody's issue. And I find it very interesting that there's a bit of a bias that the government hasn't supported men's health. And yet the thing that we are all overlooking is the fact that the majority of politicians are male. So I think when you come back to it, it comes back to the education and about our image. And I think we've changed. And is it that women get more help because they seem to be more family and community orientated, whereas men are seen to be more focused on themselves as individuals or money and stuff? So I think it comes back that society has changed and we all need to. It's not necessarily a government thing. And I don't think you can slate it all to the government because, as I said, the majority of the people that are politicians are male. So, I mean, really, they've got the vote.
Yeah, right. That's a really good point and something that, you know, comes up a lot. I mean, there's a couple of points there. Let me separate them out. Firstly, on male politicians, let's be clear, the vast majority of male politicians are not in Parliament representing men. It's just not the way that politics, in terms of men, they're there as politicians first and foremost. Someone turn the generator on. Is that? Okay, great. Thanks. I spotted the person smiling about that. I know who you are. So it doesn't, in many ways, it doesn't help us. In fact, you know, many of the best advocates for men and men's health are often female politicians. So the idea that the fact that the majority of politicians are male, I think that's therefore men's health is taken care of. I think that's a fallacy. The average male MP isn't in there advocating on behalf of men, particularly not men of the toughest background.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's interesting that when they have probably the balance of power, that there hasn't been that decision. So, you know.
Yeah, I agree, John, because they're not in there representing men. They're representing other interests, which is why you need now to be really positive about what's happened in women's health. A lot of what's happened in women's health, and this is the second point, has happened because enough women over enough time have got up and fought for it. You know, it's not that women have passively sat there and male politicians have doled out money to the women's sector. The women's sector has built over many years and fought to be recognised. So that's why
I totally agree with you there, and I put it out to the rest of the people there is that that's what it's about. It's about men getting off their ass to help themselves.
And that's why the piece about building the grassroots men's movement is really really important too, and raising the voice of men. I would always caution, again, something you see, and I'll come to, I think Faisal's got his hand, no, Giralang, Brett. I'll come to you next, Brett. One of the things you often see when groups advocate for change is this expectation that the government will actually resolve it all. And so, like you make a lot of noise, the government's got to do this, and then the government goes, okay, we'll do something about that, and then you're not around to deliver the solution. So it's not enough just to call for change. You've got to actually be able to deliver some of the solutions, which is why you need a strong grassroots community sort of led men's health sector. Otherwise, what happens is, you win an argument, and then funding will get allocated to one of those large NGOs that will take, tens of millions of dollars to do some men's health work for 3 years because there's funding there. But then in 3 years' time, they won't be focused on men's health because they follow the funding. They are dollar-driven, not purpose-driven. So that's why we need a strong, from my perspective, that's why we need a strong men's health sector. Brett, is it Brett?
Yes, it is. Look, I'm a retired nurse, mental health nurse, health administrator. I agree with you 100%, Glenn. It's consciousness raising. Men getting comfortable with talking about their needs, their issues, becoming aware of the issues like that suicide maladministration of funding. That was a problem in the 80s when I worked in mental health, and it was disgusting. But if I raise that with a group of friends, particularly if it's a mixed gender group, women get very offended. And I think, sadly, men have not spoken up. And look, some of that's deeply cultural, and part of that's from the wars, I reckon. An enormous number of Australians went to the First World War and died, maimed, injured, returned cripples, economic cripples, went to the Second War the same. So when consciousness started being raised in the 60s, there were a whole lot of people who noticed that their dads were non-communicative. They were non-communicative because they were PTSD and trauma survivors, and the culture of the time said, just get on with it. And it's probably actually quite a good culture, but it's time for a change. And I think education at schools and consciousness raising, which is why I tune into this, are the critical things, And for me, look, if I was on a rant, men have got to stop being afraid that they might be gay. I think that's the biggest thing holding us back. And it goes back to the fatal shore and convict times. Men are so afraid of being out of their straitjackets, of being a cool male, because they don't want to be called a wimp or a pansy or a poof or something like that. And that's a great disability for our group, our gender. They can't express themselves necessarily because they're afraid of stepping out of that straitjacket. If men stop being afraid of gay men and being gay, they'd be a lot better off. Sorry, that's a bit of a rant, but I think those three issues are deep, and they're problems. Speaking up is what it comes to.
Thanks, Brett. And look, I should also really have mentioned in the growth of the men's sector in the last few years, the growth of the number of organisations now working with younger men. Projects like Tomorrow Man, the Man Cave, and Top Bloke, which has been around for about 20 years, but there's been many more new ones that have emerged in the last few years. And that sort of that focus on normalizing men expressing their needs and their experiences from a young age is definitely part of a process of change that should have positive impact. I think the challenge is with that is my challenge there is always, when you encourage men to speak out and share their experience, be careful what you wish for, because some of what they share might not be what you want to hear. And there's because it's often very raw and it's often very challenging. It's often So that's part of a real ongoing process, that it's not just that first stage of making it easier for men to share their experience. It's actually them being able to hear the variety of experience that men share. Thanks for your contribution, Brett. Good to hear from both a personal perspective, but also your experience of working as a nurse. Peter Clark of Omni.
Thanks, Glenn. Like most of us on the screen, I work at a local level, so the macroscopic is a bit daunting for me. There's only 24 hours in the day. But what I do find at a local level, the important thing is to have a really coherent message, which is convincing in the political environment. And this applies to me at a local government level, and I've generally found it extremely well received to push men's issues. Now, I'm at the soft end of it. I'm not into the suicide thing and so on. I'm about social contact. However, Omni is part of COTA, and that is a federal level lobby voice. And Mr. Yates, who's our president, is very effective in lobbying for older people at the federal level. And I think that there is a potential there for perhaps me to start work at the state level, bouncing off the Omni program, which is quite successful, to take a message using perhaps some of the statistics and so forth that you put forward today, to escalate from Omni at the state level to men's health at a state level and then to federal.
And are you Victoria based, Peter?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
but we have, you know, and I know Jared Mansour. Jared is the Commissioner for Older Victorians, you know, part of the Health Department, and a very receptive voice. And I'll be meeting him in a few weeks. So it may be a time then when I can put my oar in the water.
Yeah, and look, I mean, it's great to hear that you've had, you know, positive response at the local level, Peter. And it's also my experience broadly that, and it's not all rainbows and sunshine, but broadly speaking, when and this is over 20 years of doing this work, when I get into rooms and sat around tables where conversations are taking place that affect men and boys, I would say 80% of the time when I put those issues on the table, people are receptive. It's not like there's a kind of this dark conspiracy to exclude men. It's just that men are invisible as a population and get overlooked. And if you take the issue to the table, then most of the time it will be addressed. The downside of that is if someone like me or you isn't at the table, then it doesn't get raised and it very quickly gets dropped off. And that's the point I'm making in terms of the need to build structures and networks. It sounds quite a technical and dull thing, but what it means in actuality is that at any table in Australia where there are conversations taking place that impact the health of Australians, there is someone at that table who is there advocating on behalf of men and boys and making sure that men and boys don't get dropped off the list. Not to the exclusion of any other group of people, but to be included alongside other people. So I'm very happy to continue the conversation with you outside of here about ways that we can ensure there are more opportunities and that we can, you know, support and resource you to do that and have those important conversations on behalf of, particularly on behalf of older men in Victoria. And there's Omni in New South Wales as well, isn't there?
Well, it is, but in the early days, it decided to incorporate and it went outside of Kota. Right. And it really has stagnated, unfortunately. I think there are only about 5 groups in New South Wales.
Yeah.
So I think the model we've got in Victoria has worked well, mainly through what I call organic growth. In other words, yeah, local groups create another local group next door.
Great.
Yeah, but we're going to change that with the development program over 5 years.
That's fabulous. Yeah, that's great, Pete. Great. Thanks for your contribution and thanks for being here. And let's continue this conversation beyond today.
Okay.
I'd like to go from the other end of the age spectrum, then from Omni, older men, new ideas, to young men and new ideas. Billy.
Yes. I just think there's so many stigmas out there that have been created around men and men's health, of them just not being able to speak up and either go to the doctors because they might see him as weak or come across weak. As well as with suicide, it's like if you speak up, like you can get claimed to be like man up and all those type of words are being said. And with men, if they're not heard, I feel like they just shut down. So it's about hearing men and young people It's just listening. I think to reduce those stigmas is just a mass can impact such a massive variety of men. So just reducing those stigmas, I think, will help a lot with these statistics and making them go down.
Yeah, and this has been your experience as an 18-year-old growing up, being a teenager in the last few years, is it?
Yeah, there's a lot of, I've been called to man up and all those type of things, and just seeing that, like, I watched a video the other day or yesterday. It was posted on LinkedIn. And this man was doing a speech, and he's asked in a room there's like 60 to 70 people, maybe more, to stand up if they've been affected by suicide or have had someone take their own life in their family. And 90% of that, those people stood up. And it's realizing that suicide is out there and it needs to be spoken about, and it needs to have those people, and there's all those special like organizations that are doing an amazing job out there. But it just needs to be that individual needs to have that courage to speak out and to get themselves that help that is needed. So it's very important.
Yeah, and look, thank you for taking time out from whatever it is you would normally be doing on a Monday to actually be part of this conversation. It's really appreciated and valued. I mean, today's quite a strategic conversation, but within that, this whole point you're making about men of all backgrounds, of all ages, being able to just share their experiences and stories is fundamental to what we do, which is why I highlighted it as one of the three key things that I believe we need to do, which is, that third point of ensuring men's voices are heard. And if you're around on Thursday, we have our session focused specifically on hearing men's stories. So we can start to hear about some of the actual work that's out there, and some of the examples and what we need to do in the future to help more men like yourself share your stories. So thanks for being here, Billy.
Thank you.
Please stick around.
Yeah, I will do.
Kerry, you need to unmute.
Hear me?
Yay!
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually interesting because it kind of, what I was going to say also relates to what Billy just said. Before you were talking about boys' education, working in schools for 12 years on the Sunshine Coast, predominantly with boys, I just saw such unfair treatment. And I think so much is expected of boys, so much more than girls. And, my thoughts there are that why? Guys have been through the same emotional experiences as women, yet there's so much more expected of them at school. And so I ran a large mentoring program for young boys, and I just saw such a massive change in their lives, having that person turn up for them each week, just for an hour. And I think I run this platform where I invite men and women to share their stories. But I think we need to have a wider platforms for men to share their stories. For the men that I've dealt with, I feel that a lot of women feel like they can openly share their stories with their girlfriends and everything like that. But for men, I feel like there's this sense that they feel like they need an invitation to share their story, and it's not given very often. And when I've had guys share their story on my Stories of Hope platform, I've had quite a few of the men actually come up to me with tears in their eyes and say, thank you for giving me a voice. And so I feel that it's so therapeutic for men to be able to share their stories. And as a counsellor, we need to listen more carefully to men and just provide those wider platforms for them to feel like they have the invitation openly to open up.
Great. Thank you, Kerry. Thanks for the work you do. Make sure you share a link in the chat box so people can find out more about what you're up to. I'm gonna come to Ian first and then Graham next. I want to come to Ian first because there's a lovely mentoring connection there from what you've just said.
Thanks, Glenn, and great to hear what Kerry was saying there. To me, there's a couple of key messages we want to get out, and I related to what Billy was saying before. There's this reluctance, this shame that a lot of men feel about seeking help. We have this ridiculous impression of what a man is. You know, for me, it's a cross between James Bond and Indiana Jones or whatever in here. And I'm so far removed from that in reality. I'm this soft, tender, non-man sort of like, and I'd love to see a campaign and with maybe some high profile people that encourage men to reach out and seek help, and even to, and whatever that support would be. And I think it's, I think it's so key to improving the welfare of men and the people around them. It should be a separate campaign, not a public campaign around the lack of social or lack of justice around the women versus men thing. And what you said before, Glenn, I see frequently our best advocates are women who see how unfair this current setup is. And going back to John's point, I think part of the issue is political. We've had appalling behaviour from politicians, particularly federal politicians, and the response as a vote grabber response is to throw money at women to try and appease voters. And I think we need to be a lot better than that. We need to change that. So I don't know where the money comes from, but I'd be glad to take part in with the relationships I've got with politicians to try and change that. And so they're the two key messages. Let's get men, encourage men to reach out, and let's get some justice around the whole way we treat men versus women in this area. Should be noted, in many other areas, women are unfairly treated around equal pay, around a whole pile of other stuff. So it's not, we're focusing on this because this is what we care about. But there's many areas where women are unfairly treated as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Ian, or Ian Deanna, should I call you? I think there's a couple of points of nuance in terms of that. That's encouraging help seeking. It needs to be matched with encouragement of help giving as well, because it's not enough just to say men go and get help and then they go and get help and they find the help they receive is just not what they expected. So like rebuilding our ability to give help, and often actually that's a more effective way of engaging men, because they want to see themselves as the hero, the helper first, rather than the help seeker. And if we can build communities of help giving, which is what so many men's groups and men's projects do, they create communities of help giving where you normalize it, then it just makes it a lot easier for men to get help anyway.
Clearly, that's where I see mentoring men, and a huge advantage, and I'm going to put a plug in here, that we have over the professionals. If a bloke goes and talks to a professional, it's almost confirmation in their own mind that they're broken in some way.
Yeah.
But if they go and have a chat to a bloke, Glenn's just another bloke. I can go and talk to him. I trust him. He keeps it confidential. And I think most of the issues we're facing here aren't issues that it's loneliness, it's isolation. It doesn't need professional support. It needs love. It needs care. That's what's missing in this thing. That's
great, Ian. Thank you. And the other point about, there are areas where women experience inequality and injustice. It's absolutely the case. What we're not very sophisticated at doing is being able to say, well, there's areas where women, struggle, and there's areas where men struggle. It's either like, women have it worse or men have it worse. Even in COVID, I've seen senior people in government saying, well, COVID clearly hit women harder than men. And it's like, that's such a ridiculous thing to say. Everyone was impacted in COVID. Some of us are impacted in the same ways. Some of us are impacted in different ways. Something we'll cover in depth in the next session. But we're not very good at saying, well, men and women have both been affected during COVID, and there's different ways that have been affected, and we need to respond to those different ways. We tend to do this, setting men and women against each other, but we need to actually address the issues that men and boys face, in addition to the issues that women and girls face, never in opposition. But there are times where we need to flag up that injustice when it comes to things like the funding piece. So Graham and John, I think we've got time. Graham?
Now, just to make an observation, I work in community mental health. I've spent 16 years and up at mental health nurse. One thing that gives me encouragement is that the younger cohort are more open to discussing their mental health and it's good to see so many names. So that gives me hope for the future. But the real challenge is as you go older in the cohorts, the openness declines unless it comes to an absolute crisis. So they come to me in crisis. So yeah, it's about how to bridge that gap so that, you know, rather than in crisis, we can catch them earlier. And the other thing is, I've supported men and women through COVID. We're all affected, not just one was infected worse than the other. Maybe some differences, but you know, hearing that comment about women affected more than men, no, there might have been different, each affected them in different ways, but everyone was affected. In the mental health side, I saw, particularly up to the end of last year, to beginning of this year, was huge. So yeah, how do we, so getting back to my original comment, how do we reach those older cohorts is one thing I've been scratching my head about, as well as supporting younger cohorts in the movement. They're going to be more open about mental health. Yeah, that's fantastic observations, Graham. And you know, in that explosion of mental health projects, most of those new mental health projects that we've been seeing emerging at community level have been like working age men. But then there's also these great, there's sheds, there's group like Omni, Older Men New Ideas. There's the Older Men's Network in Toowoomba, which does an amazing job of connecting to hundreds of older men in their area. So there are projects out there which can help us connect to those cohorts. But you're right, it's patchy. It's patchy in terms of the support that's available, and also the ability of the right men to access those supports. And we will dive into the COVID question in the next session, but there's a point to make there which kind of like highlights the kind of one of the broad messages I'm making. There's this big improvement, but there's also some areas where we just seem to be stubbornly stuck. And on the COVID point, we got funded by the National Mental Health Commission to do research into what was the impact of COVID-19 on men's mental health. So that's a leap forward. They actually picked up the phone and said to us, we're looking at all these populations. We're not looking at men. We need someone to look at men. Will you look at men? That is a leap forward. That wasn't happening 5 years ago. So they were actively reaching out to us and asking us to find stuff out. And then at the same time, someone else in the National Mental Health Commission goes public and says women are clearly far more affected by COVID than men. So you know, you've got these sort of like these contradictions that we're making some progress, but there's still this overall conversation that men are fine. So yeah, it's long slope. Not in my experience from what people came in to see me here. No, not in the experience of our research or in the any of the dozens of mental health practitioners that we spoke to around the country in the last 6 to 12 months. Yeah. Okay, Dom.
Yes, look, I wanted to pick up on what Kerry was saying about men's voices. As I said before, I'm doing in the small group, I'm doing research on non-resident fathers and their desired relationship with their children, what helps and what hinders that. And while there's a lot written about non-resident fathers, most of it is about fathers, but not from the fathers. And my research is strictly and clearly to reflect the voice of the men. And I'm currently doing research, undertaking the interviews, and I'll tell you, some of those interviews are just harrowing. All the issues you've talked about are there, but more and more compacted, because many of these men are experiencing marginalization and disempowerment. There's an extraordinary stigma. For some reason, they're also 100% blamed for the breakdown of the relationship, when for many men, they're just left, have had no idea this was coming, and they're just left floundering. And I'm wondering if there isn't some link between PTSD and separation and divorce. So this is all very nebulous. I just want to talk about it in the sense that I'm really keen to complete this research. I'm still needing participants. a lot of what has been talked about today has resonated me so much and has just underpinned much more of what I'm thinking. I'm not sure where I can go with that, but I really just wanted to let you know this was my focus, that it's about men from men's perspective. What is their voice? I'm not interpreting it. I'm not going to theorize about it. And in one sense, I'm taking some feminist approaches of where you say, what are the men saying? What is their language? What is the issues? What are they doing? And just focusing on them rather than looking at them in relationship to children, looking at them in relationship to domestic violence. Domestic violence is another issue which is enormous. Female perpetrated domestic violence, which is coming forward so strongly in my research, and yet nobody wants to know about it. There's nowhere these people can go. The other thing is the role of the police. We have not yet talked about men and police. And police's attitude to men is dreadful. And that's something we need to talk about as well. So I'm sorry if I'm ranting, but I'll stop right there.
It's all about hearing men's voices, Dom, and you're raising your own voice, but also creating a platform to raise the voice of an issue that many men have experienced, and absolutely. And this goes to the point of we need to get men's voices into the public and policy conversation. And some of the voices that most need to be, sorry, Dom, some of the voices that most need to be heard are very angry and very raw. And so there needs to be mechanisms in place, like your research, like training for men on how to communicate their lived experience, to enable those voices to be not sanitized, but to be able to those stories to be presented in a way that can be heard. There's a sort of there's a gap there, and sometimes some of the loudest voices are not the ones we necessarily want to share. So the work you're doing, I think, is massively important, and really happy to stay in the conversation about it.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that I'd be happy to continue this conversation privately with other people if people would like to get in touch with me. Sorry.
Details in the text box. I'm going to formally, there could be more conversation in the next couple of minutes, but for the sake of our bladders and our well-being, I'm going to formally end the session there, but I know some more of you still want to chip in, and you can in the break. So let me formally end this session. Thank you very much. I've taken on board everything that's been shared. I'll be going through all the stuff that's shared in the chat. Please continue this conversation. I want to be having this conversation in 5 years' time, and I want there to be a shift and a change that we can trace back to this conversation today. Time to take a break if you need it. We'll be starting the next session at 11:15. And so for the sake of the production team, this is the formal end of this session.